Are you a Scrum Master with a short attention span? Do you want to learn how to slice and how to swarm, but you ain't got time for a deep dive? Okay, fine. I'm going to try and give you about a 10-minute guide. Don't got time for any kind of chit chat. Let's just go. Ready? Here we go. Okay, so here we go. We're going to talk through my steps to analyze how well or how poorly your teams are functioning before you even start thinking about slicing. What do? What are my steps? First, I observe and analyze how well the team is working. I look at their metrics for this. So you got to go out, you got to gather their metrics, you got to make sense of the metrics, you've got to use the metrics as the magic mirror to depersonalize the conversation and help to lead the team to the conclusion that they need to slice or they need to swarm. You use powerful questions to ask open-ended questions to get them to contemplate what you're trying to teach them. And then you can begin to ask them, what are the reasons you think why you're carrying over your stories? And perform a form of Parito Analysis to find the top 2 or 3. And if large stories is part of the problem, then you start to talk about swarming or slicing. Before you get to that point, you got to make sure that you're not trying to push a technique on them that they don't need. So make sure that your metrics support you. How do I know if I'm doing the right thing? Well, if the predictability of the team shows that the team is stable, if you'll notice there, you see your committed and your completed are really, really close. They typically deliver what they say they're going to do. And if the percent complete is greater than 80% on a regular basis, okay, that's a good sign. They're doing something right. And if you look at your burn down and it looks a little bit like this, and there's stories that are being delivered early and often, and the stories appear to be small, and they're getting over for approval all throughout the sprint, that's a good sign. And if you also take a look at your flow metrics, such as your cumulative flow diagram, and you see that the CFD confirms that you've got a reduced band of in progress, that's a reduced WIP, okay, and a regular flow, where things are getting completed all throughout the sprint, that matches what you're seeing in your burn down, right? And if you look at your cycle time and you see that your stories are typically done in just a few days, not bad. So your cycle time confirms it. Guess what? Then I just praise the team and I say, good for you. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. They're doing something right. Leave them alone. But what if that's not the case? What if the predictability shows, as these do, that the team consistently over promises and under delivers? Something is wrong. They're not able to deliver at least 80% of what they're committing to. And if you look at your percentage complete and it's well below 80%, like 57%, 60%, that's not so good. Maybe we need to do something. What if the burn down is as flat as Florida? And it looks a little bit like this. Stories are not getting to done early. And, maybe there's a big drop of stuff on the testers at the end of the sprint. That ain't pretty. That's not good. Could be a sign of big stories. If your CFD looks terrible like this, and you see a huge band of work in progress, that's probably not great. That could be a cause, especially if you see a lot of fluctuations like this. But here's what we're looking for. Do we see that you have frequent changes in sprint scope, stories not being completed until late in the sprint, there's an irregular flow? That's not good. If your cycle time is really high, it takes you 16, 14 days to complete a story, that's not great. And guess what? The metrics are trying to tell you something. This is why we have retrospectives, and you should be asking a series of important questions. What trend does the committed versus completed graph show for us, guys? Let's look at our metrics. What percentage of our stories are being carried over? Does this look impressive? Is this the way we want to work? What's our average story cycle time? Explain to them what cycle time means. From the time we start something to the time it gets to done. Does it surprise you to know it takes you 15, 16, 17 days to complete a story? Does our burn down show progressive delivery of value over to testing and over to approval? At any time during the sprint, what is our average WIP count? Do we have too much work in progress? Do we have any agreement on that? Are we applying WIP? Scrum teams often don't, but maybe we should. Does the team demonstrate individual story ownership? Everybody owns a story? Or do we show that it's collective and shared and we're swarming it? Okay, if you're saying that every developer has a story, then you're not swarming. They're doing individual story ownership. And you can take a snapshot of the board to demonstrate that that's what's happening and use that as evidence and say, does this look like something we might want to change? What's the average size of our stories? You can go pull that. You go research that. Go find out from the story points. And if you have typically a cycle time of 14 days and all your stories are 8-point stories, then that kind of makes sense, right? Because they're big stories, big cycle time. But if they're all 2 or 3 points, but they're taking 14, 15, 18 days to complete, does that indicate that maybe your story pointing process down here, maybe your story pointing process is not good? Have the team write on some stickies the reasons that they think is going on. Have them put some stickies on the board and then have them vote and come up with the top 3 reasons. And that should be able to enable you to drive the conversation about what can we do to reverse this trend. Once you have all of those reasons given, you can perform a kind of Parito analysis. So let's take a look at that. In this case, let's say that these are the top reasons they gave. Unclear requirements, sprint churn. That means there's a lot of change and transition within the sprint. Stories come in, stories go out. They're swapping stories around. And maybe they have unstable environments. The top 3, notice that those top 3 are unclear requirements, high levels of churn, unstable environment. This doesn't really have anything to do with stories that are too big, does it? These have other problems that require other types of solutions. So if this is what the team says, guess what you probably should not try to push right now? On the count of 3. Say it with me. I'm not going to try and push them to slice and swarm because the problems that they're giving are others. Now let's look at another Parito analysis. Now look at this one. This one's very different. So the top reasons here are stories are too big. There's errors in estimation. In other words, we have 1 and 2 point stories with 70 or 80 hours. That doesn't look like they sized them right. There's too much sprint churn. They're pulling stories in and out. Now in this one, you do have stories are too big. And it's indicated by the metrics. Remember, your cycle time is high and your burn down plateaus. These are related to sizing as well as a couple of other product owner issues. So do you think maybe we could work on creating smaller stories, fixing our estimation process so that we understand story sizing better? Now, the team has had some say in this. They have provided their input. Let's go through a quick guide on swarming and slicing. Let's assume that we settle on that for this conversation and move quickly. First thing I want to do, review story estimation, establish a simple rubric, make sure they understand how to size stories, and you've got to monitor to make sure it makes sense. Then we want to review the reasons why we have frequent delivery and why we want small stories or we want swarming. Make sure they understand what the benefit is and that they agree to it. You don't want to just try and do this in the dark. Once they understand that, they may be willing to work with you. Model out how individual story ownership of large stories impacts the flow. If you have one person and it's, all the tasks add up to 17 or 18 days and you have, create a little Gantt chart type of view like this and you say on day 1, you do this, on day 2, you do these tasks, on day 3. But you have to understand what those subtasks are, don't you? And you have to understand what their duration is and then show them using their own stories what this looks like. And this is why it's taking you 15, 18, 20 days to complete a story. You can model it. You've seen it. I've done it a couple of different ways. I've got the same guy and I've drawn it out this way. You could do this with stickies on a board. Then start reviewing vertical story slicing as a concept. Why do we go vertically through the architecture, including UI, the business logic layer, service layers, data layers? And how do we then deliver sprint over sprint? There's a couple of anti-patterns you want to review. Make sure they understand those. Step number 1 for slicing is, can we slice out acceptance criteria and spread them across smaller stories? For example, if we use the Travelocity Expedia model, right? Book a flight. As a traveler, I need the ability to search on flights between any cities in the United States so I compare flight cost, number of stops, duration before purchasing a ticket. What are the acceptance criteria? Look at everything the product owner put in there. Ability to select the city of origination and select the destination and the ability to select the number of passengers and the ability to select any date range, ability to select one-way, multi-city, round trip, ability to select a preferred airline, ability to view search results in one page, ability to change how many matching flights per page. Well, what if we split the story by taking some of these acceptance criteria out? Is that possible? Of course it is. Take those out and put them in the next stories. So just find a way of simplifying the story by taking some of the acceptance criteria out. Most teams automatically are doing this. This isn't so hard. If that's not being done very well, or that's where they're really struggling, now guide them to go create detailed subtasks for these stories. Pick out a couple of the big stories and have them put in detailed subtasks and estimate their hours. Here's all the steps they have to do. Over here, here's how many hours. That's what you're looking for. Then you're going to want to review very briefly. Go back to humanizingwork.com. Go get the how to split a user story guide. Learn how to use the 3 steps. Prepare the input story. Make sure it meets invest. apply the splitting patterns based upon whether or not the story is on operations, business rule variations, variations in data, interface variations, major efforts, simple, complex, deferring some of the non-functional requirements perhaps, and workflow steps. My other videos have a lot more details. Today we're just going as fast as possible. But you need to review this with the team. If the team can't figure out how to slice it, can they swarm it? So you need to look at those subtasks again and say, well, gosh, guys, let's look at the details of those stories. Are there any step dependencies? In other words, are there tasks that can be done without any other dependencies? Or are there others that cannot be done until a previous one is done? That's a step dependency. Also ask which tasks must be done before the others can be done, and which tasks can be performed concurrently by different team members. For example, can we have one developer write test cases while another one is doing the design? Of course. Can somebody be writing the interface while somebody else is working on the Git service? Of course you can. Can somebody be writing the unit tests at the same time someone else is writing the service? Can more than one person write a service? If you have a get, put, and post service, can two different developers be working on the different services? Then can you model out how this would work? Which ones can be done concurrently? So these two can be done concurrently. These three can be done concurrently. These two can be done concurrently. All right, so once you begin to lay out, you can put those stickies up on a board and have them work out what can be worked at the same time, which ones have step dependencies. And once you've done that, once you've learned how to swarm, and you've worked on slicing in a couple of others, then you begin to ask, is it possible to take some of these big stories and combine both slicing and swarming? So we can complete stories every couple of days until we finish the feature every week. There you go. Remember that it's perfectly fine to start with just one example, just one story. Get them to experiment with just one, and then move on. Go find your allies, go find the people on the team who are willing to experiment, and give it a shot. We're in, we're out, we're done. That's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.